Yes.
Is that
Yeah,
good?
that's good, Jim.
You see good? All right, good. Sorry about that. Just different size screens make it all come up a little bit different. So to go further down the road that Mr. DeBello was explaining, we did present changes to the budget as it has gone through its rendition since February. We did that last week at the board work session on Monday, and coming out of that, the board recommended an additional finance committee meeting, which we held on Thursday, at which time, of course, the board also directed Dr. Gooden to develop some scenarios where we might be able to, I guess, remove things from the budget, for lack of a better term. In that meeting, we discussed a number of different scenarios. I'm going to kind of roll through them and talk about the ones, at least, that the committee had gotten input from the rest of the board as well that was on the call, ones that they recommended looking at to see what the impact to the budget model would be. So I'm going to take it from there, and I'm going to kind of talk briefly about each one of these areas. I'm not going to get into a ton of detail, but they were, we had a list of new hires that the district deems critical to the success of the district. Those are included in this slide here, or in this screen here. The committee, along with the input from the rest of the board, decided that this group in yellow could be removed, and to see what that looks like. So that's where we're at this point. We looked at retirements and whether or not retirements should be replaced. The board decided they would like to keep those positions in and replace them, since the need had been demonstrated years ago for these positions. We looked at the eliminating of any salary increases for the non-teacher staff. That would be these groups here. These are the percentages that are included in the budget currently. The board and the committee decided to not touch that at this time. We looked at potential program eliminations or cuts. The strings program, again, decided not to make a move. We looked at extracurriculars, again, decided not to make a move. School police reduction in the force, we decided not to make a move. The instructional coaches also decided not to make a move. I don't know, Tom, I don't know how much detail you want me to go into any of these items, but if you need me to go into more, I'm happy to do so.
No, I mean, you're so far. I mean, that's where we're at. I mean, recommendation is to bring it forward to the board, the full board. I mean, because we have to vote on things officially at some point in the near future.
Correct. Okay, so then I'll just press on in the same manner. We looked at the potential of increasing class sizes up to in the elementaries from their current status to up to 28. What the impact of that would be. Decided not to make a move on that. We talked about potentially deferring our transfer of capital project funds. We had in here $1 million. I think it was $1,048,000 is where we started on this number. We decided that we would potentially do $500,000. So we took a look at what that looked like. The curriculum budget, again, the same type of thing, which is a deferral of funds for the future purchases of curriculum. We decided to put a deferral on that to the tune of about $487,000. And then finally, we looked at the potential of doing a similar thing with the IT IT infrastructure, in which the board decided not the right time to do that, at least at this point. So we took those amounts into account. It totaled up to about 1.1 million or so, somewhere in that neighborhood. And as I move over to this slide, I'm hoping that everyone can see that this is the column that I'm focused on for this coming year. We were sitting at a deficit of about $4.7 million. Those changes overall bring it down to about almost $3.6 million. and down from a 4.3% in potential tax change to a 3.2% potential tax change. What it also did, which is important to look at, is to look at this column here, because this is the following year as we press forward. Because the changes, as I mentioned in the previous slide, are mainly deferrals. We still would have to catch up on some of those in the coming years. And the impact there was, I look at this number down here, which is the potential tax impact to that. We started before those changes at about 4.26%, going in just because of the typical year-over-year growth. And that, of course, got bumped up to 5.6, because essentially what you don't do this year, you do in the following year or the coming years. That's where we stand as of right now, with, and we're looking for further direction from the board as to what you would like to do and where you'd like us to go from here.
Jim, one of the things that we should also think seriously about from the board perspective is that we need to plan some type of virtual town hall meeting or something like that to actually explain the details, really dive in with something similar to what we did back in 2010 when we were faced with a similar situation where we really dove into, you know, the budgeting of the district and really showing where, you know, the numbers and going over, and I mean, communicating outward to the community so they truly see and understand what we're confronted with.
I support that, Mr. DeBello. I think it will give, you know, greater detail to the community. And as you said, they can see exactly what we're dealing with. Everything's transparent. It's in black and white, and they can see what the impacts are one way or the other.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. They need to know what the cost, the actual cost of reducing this what costs to the districts occur in the long term effect it has.
I agree with that also. I think it's, I think we should do that. I'll leave my statement with that.
How does the rest of the board feel?
I agree.
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 Thank you.
So with regard to the town hall, that's a logistics, set it up, and I really look forward to conversations. I think that in the past few weeks, we've had a lot of conversations, and I think we're moving in the right direction. I do recognize there's a timeline associated with this process, but you know, I really look forward to continuing to explore and do it in a collaborative manner, sort of how we can lower the tax burden for this particular year. So I do appreciate the continued investment of time to my colleagues on the board and also administration to go through and sort of sharpen the pencil on all of the conversations. So I look forward to continuing it.
Well, I guess from a board perspective, we could end it here, or is there anything that we want to further discuss this evening related to anything that was on the list of recommendations? Because we are on unfortunately, we are in a timeline which we have no control over. It's a state regulated timeline that that the state has not, as of now, as of yet, have made any changes to those timelines that school districts are required to follow. So for instance, one of the things that I look at is that we were discussing, and that I mentioned last week, was that freezing all new hires. Is that something that the board wants to have further conversation regards this evening? I'm just trying to figure out where we want to go with this.
Yeah, I think that's a worthy topic for discussion, Mr. DeBello.
I would agree, and I would say that perhaps we just look at this as a delay of these positions for 1 year, a delay of a number of items for 1 year. Not that we necessarily are 100% required to make up all of it in the next year, but that we pick up this year and move it forward. Meaning that we don't do these new hires at this time. At least I think there should be discussion around that.
I want to
So,
clarify,
Mark,
are we talking about new hires? Or are we talking about replacing the retirees? Because I see them as two different categories.
I believe at this point, we're just talking new hires.
So, Mr. DeBello, if I understand correctly, where we are right now is, with these proposed items and a little further down on the agenda, there will be a vote as to whether or not to publish this preliminary budget. But in the meantime, I think as a board, all really feel that we want to continue to find ways to minimize the impact from a tax perspective on our community. I am very concerned with our starting point for next year as well, because kicking the can down the road, it could come back to bite us. So I do want to be mindful of that. And as we continue to look at things like these new hires and positions and really work with administration and have administration continue and doing the awesome job they've been doing to look for other opportunities. But I think that's kind of the direction we're going in at this point, is to eventually later in the meeting accept this preliminary, but then continue to work through those reductions and provide some additional guidance to administration in terms of where to focus. Is that accurate? Is that summary of where we are?
Well, is Mark Fitzgerald on the phone or on the call? Is he
Somewhere.
Mark? You here?
I am here. I am here. Can you
Mark,
hear me?
could you? Thank you. Could you explain? Could you explain the process as far as if we approve the preliminary advertising budget this evening, we still over the next few weeks can continue to reduce or make changes to the budget without jeopardizing our timelines? Could you explain that, please?
Absolutely. Under the school code, section 687, you are simply required to approve a proposed final budget 30 days prior to adopting a final budget. Springford has adopted a timeline procedure that frankly gives you effectively double the amount of time at this point. And during this time period, up till June 30th, which is your deadline to approve a budget, you can whittle down the budget from an expenditures perspective, what you would expect in terms of the millage rate. You have the freedom to do anything you need to do in order to bring in a budget that can be approved by a majority of the board. All you're doing this evening is approving a process that will allow something to be posted and reviewed by the public.
Mark, quick question on that. If we advertise or put a budget up for 30 days and during that process, we have reductions or we make changes to that budget, are we allowed to repost the revised version, or do we have to stay with the one that's out there?
I don't think there is any prohibition from posting additional documentation. You will have fulfilled your statutory requirement by posting this budget here. And if you want to post additional documents for the public to see, that's going to be at the discretion of the board and certainly would be something that you could do.
Okay, got it.
Just to clarify a little bit, because I was looking at the dates and such. Mark, if we if we took our time with this, because it is such a monumental task, and we didn't vote to publish it until, say, the work session in May. If we called for a vote at that work session in May, would we still be within the stated or the mandated timeline to then vote for the approval at the June board meeting?
Yeah, I mean, if this was May today, I'd be concerned about your timeline. But you could theoretically approve the proposed final budget likely at your work session in May, which I think is roughly around May 18th or so, and then be able to, in a timely fashion, approve your budget at your regular second meeting in June, which I think is roughly around June 22nd or so, just my recollection of the calendar. Obviously, that the downside of it is just simply approving a budget late to get out then tax duplicates. But other than that, you would still be well within your timeline if you held off until your work session in May.
I would recommend against that. The reason why we backed it up, and that's why I wanted Mark to explain the process. The reason why we backed it up is because we don't want to be in a situation, because that 30-day, that time is very specific. So we could effectively do everything we want to do, put a preliminary post, whatever you want to call it, post it, advertise or whatever, and we could continue to put things out for the public over the next couple of weeks. But we built in the flexibility so that don't become in a desperate situation where we have to have approval by a certain date, because by June 30th it absolutely has to be done. And on the flip side, we backed it up because of all the tax bills and everything that has to be printed and processed and everything else. So I'm not saying that I agree with this budget. I think that we have work that we could still do on it. I think we have some ideas that we want to continue to work through, but that doesn't preclude us from meeting one of the state requirements to post something. And literally, if we post this up there, would actually help us as well as when we have this virtual town hall meeting, whatever that turns out to be. But this is kind of already floated out there so people can see what we're dealing with. So I really, really would recommend that we don't cut our time short. That's just my opinion.
So the advantage is we're getting the information out. We don't have to agree with this tonight of what's here. We'll get the information out. We meet the state mandate in terms of time well in advance of that. And then we take our time the rest of this period to really go through this line item by line item and try to make things work a little bit better. Is that my understanding?
Absolutely.
Exactly.
We could continue to work. We could continue to work extremely hard on what we're trying to achieve as an end goal. Our end goal is to get to zero as close as possible, or get to zero, whatever that may be. We continue to do that work, but there's nothing that prevents us, and it really would put us at a disadvantage to not get something up just to meet that 30-day requirement. It's just one of those check the box state things. Right, Mark Fitzgerald? If I'm saying anything that's inaccurate, please.
I think that's a fair way of describing it. You are checking a box along the budget process tonight. That's simply what you're doing.
And we're not approving this budget in any way, shape, or form that's here. We are merely checking a box, meeting a state mandate, and we're going to continue to work on it. Correct?
Correct.
Colleen, the action that we are approving is publishing what we currently have. That's it. That would be the vote tonight, is we're voting on publishing what we currently have. We are not agreeing to it, and we are continuing to work through it to get it to where it meets the needs of our community and our students.
Correct. And I think Colleen was what Colleen was pointing out, and we have to make sure that everyone is totally understanding that's dialed in from the public. We're not approving anything this evening. This is just a draft that we're putting up because we have to meet a state requirement to publish something. And this is where we are at this point in time. and we will continue to work on making changes to the budget because nothing is approved until that final vote that will either occur sometime in May or sometime early June or whatever it may be. And that's when the board at that point will take an official vote on the budget.
And this will be a useful tool then for also for that virtual town hall meeting. This would actually give the community something to see in writing, which is a lot easier to kind of digest than it is to just hear about it.
Correct. And I think that virtual town hall meeting is important because over the weekend, I decided to post something up on Facebook. It wasn't widespread, but I got a lot of feedback from people that connected in some form. And it was very interesting to see the feedback. And that's why we need to make sure that we go to, as many people as we possibly can, and unfortunately we can't do it live in person, so we have to do virtual.
And we can't reach everyone on Facebook. So it is important to have that virtual town meeting, that another outlet to try to give people the opportunity to voice their opinions one way or the other. So I would agree with that. Okay, is there any more conversation from the board about this or discussion from the board about the presentation?
So we're not doing anything to this budget this evening then?
I think everybody understands that.
Okay. No, I just want to make sure because tomorrow I don't want to hear, oh, we should have did this or we should have did that. This is the board's opportunity to make any change as of right now.
I'm going to reiterate that we should do a hiring freeze on the new hires, throwing it out there for discussion.
Duly noted.
Okay, so I guess then the directive from the board is to have another finance committee meeting in the near future. Is that what I'm hearing?
I support that.
Okay, so I know that Jim and his staff in the next day or two will be working on getting some information. And so we'll be carrying that forward. But I did ask, Jim, did you get any updated information related to that you may want to talk about real quick as far as what we're seeing, the impacts of the recent unemployment or how we're analyzing numbers or what we're looking at?
Yeah, we looked at we looked at data from the feds. We looked at data from the county. We looked at data from from Pennsylvania. The data that I got regarding claims and such over the past few weeks, very difficult to get through. In fact, when I looked through some of the reports, in fact, Beth was instrumental at getting some of that for me today. Thank you very much, Beth. Some of the reports were actually conflicting each other. And one of the reports, which was interesting to me, even said, hey, don't use this if we're using any of the other reports. So it was quite confusing. So the best thing I think that I could really do was to look at what the impacts or the unemployment situation was over the past 10 years and try to extrapolate to some sort of trend analysis. So I did do a little digging. Let me see if I can call it up here. Sorry, nobody wants to see that.
That's okay.
It was fun though, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, a little entertainment, I suppose. So I went through data. I don't know. Can you guys see that?
Yep.
Big enough? Is that big enough?
Yeah.
Yes.
Men's on that. I can get a little bit more, but so I went through, unemployment data. This was back in 2010, and then all the way up through 2020, and then the couple of months that we're at right now. And just to kind of look at the trends, this of course was back in 2010 was one of the bigger or the higher levels of unemployment from the financial crisis, from 07, 08. It's a trailing factor there. And you can see from this that even back then, when the U.S. unemployment rate was 9.3, Montco, our county was 7.3. So I found that kind of interesting that we were we were a little bit lower than the federal average, and we were even lower than the state average. And as you proceed outward in the years, you can see as the U.S. and the PA rates go down, ours in the county do as well. Of course, they do at a slower rate because there's just not as much room to move. And one thing that I found interesting, of course, was that the county was always lower than the state average, which is a great thing when you look at it that way. So, but we did level off with, pretty much with the federal numbers at the end. So in February, the Fed had 3.2% unemployment, so did we. Our state had 4.7, which was great, that we were lower than that, but we did end up evening off. So I went through and I just tried to extrapolate some numbers. I went through and looked at, well, what percent of Montgomery County is compared to the state. So if I look at, compare these two numbers, I can see that Montgomery County at the time of, one of the highest points of unemployment back in 2010, we were about 78.5% of what the federal unemployment rate was as reported. And you can see that tended to, to carry all the way through until we got to the more recent years, and then it kind of it fluctuated around as would be expected as well. So what I tried to do is I tried to say, well, if that's true, back in 2010 when we were at one of our, our highest points of unemployment in the previous crisis, and if we held the same percentage that we did back then of the federal, I looked back to see that Reuters over here, Reuters was, the last day or two was reporting, they're estimating that the numbers aren't in for April yet. So everybody's, trying to pick the right number. Reuters is usually a pretty good place to go. They predicted that we're at about 16% currently, and that might fluctuate a little bit upward towards once we get to the end of the month. So if I look at that and I compare that 78.5% to that 16, that would mean that Monco would be around 12.5% of unemployment. Then if I look at our population as I go down here, which is kind of interesting, the breaks of our population, number one, we have about 50,000 residents or so in our district. 0 to 17 is, these are the percentages of all the age brackets. And if you look at the working age, which again, this is rough stuff here, but if I look at the working age, it's about 62% of the total. So that would mean our working age residents it's about 30,600. And when I look at what unemployment rate was prior to the current crisis that we're in of 3.2, that would mean that about 980 people in our district were already unemployed. So at the 12.6%, which I had stated up here, if I look at the 12.6%, the total unemployment currently would be approximately 3,850, which would mean the difference between these two numbers, who was already unemployed prior to the crisis versus the newlies, would mean that we've increased our unemployment by about 2,864. Again, they're rough guesses, but I'm trying to get, using the best data that I can find, the most accurate, to extrapolate some stuff out. Again, too, is, another impact here that I was thinking about after preparing this was, or looking at this was, in this bracket here, we're saying 18 to 24. I'm including that in working age. In our district, what is the percentage of graduates from Springford that, that go to the next level of, college or whatever it might be, that would not be considered part of the working force? So that would probably reduce that number, thereby reduce this number. Maybe if it's 75%, then this number here would go down by about 200. So those are just trying to get a rough idea of what it looks like from an unemployment impact of where we're at. My feedback on that.
Good work, Jim.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, I'd just like to thank you, Jim, for all of that. It was very informative.
This is crazy, but this is the kind of stuff that I like doing, all this economic stuff. It's interesting, and just to see where this is going. And as the assumptions, as more data comes out, we can refine our assumptions and look at it and see how it adjust those numbers to see what those impacts really are.
Jim, your mic wasn't muted when you said you enjoy this stuff.
Oh.
Doing all this analysis. No, I mean, thank you for the detail that you're going. And as the board recalls over the weeks, he's also showed the detail and assumptions that go into figuring out other things like earned income tax and real estate transfer tax and everything else. I mean, it's not just done off the cuff. There's a lot of data mining that he's doing and comparing and looking at historical information, as well as trying to stay as current as possible as the numbers will be being published. So we're definitely trying to stay on top of as best we can, understanding the complete impacts on the entire district. I did also reach out out of curiosity. I just reached out to one of the township managers in one of our townships. I don't want to get specific, but I was just talking with them, asking them what are they doing, how are they going through deciding on their what their impacts are looking at, and pleasantly that we were right on target with their they're thinking the same way as far as looking at loss of revenues related to declining interest income because the interest rates have dropped, looking at what they know or what they're projecting as far as going off of the unemployment numbers as well, or what's being advertised, and what how their earned income tax is going to be impacted. So we're all kind of going down the same road, looking at the impact of what this pandemic and unfortunately, Jim has to do it on a grander scale because we make up 4 municipalities and we're at 170 million plus budget. So this kind of detail, and I know you have a lot of data behind this, but this kind of detail is extremely important, that we know exactly what we're seeing.
I have two questions related to this. I know you said that you'll continue to gather data, Jim, on the unemployment. Do these numbers, as you've found them in the data, does this include people that have reduced incomes? Because I know a number of people that are not necessarily collecting unemployment, but have taken a reduction in their pay.
No, this would be strict unemployment data. So if people are filing claims to the unemployment desk, that's the data that gets reported out. Those reports typically come out, Bloomberg does a great one every month, but those are monthly reports and they're usually lagging probably 2 to 3 weeks after the end of a month. March would have been too soon because the full impact hadn't really happened at that point. We'll get some good stuff going into, probably towards the mid to latter part of May, at least preliminaries on how, that impact has been, not just for unemployment, but also for, yes, reduction in pay, and also for, that would be the underemployment number.
Mm-hmm. Underemployment.
And then also they try to do estimates on folks on the sidelines too, which I would argue this time around, considering it's so fresh, that number is probably very low, because people's unemployment benefits have not kicked out yet. They're really just getting started.
Very true.
Jim, this is Diane Sullivan. I wanted to ask, when you talked about reduced pay, does that come from regardless of reason, like for people whose hours have been cut way back to like 16 a week instead of 40 a week? I take it that would be reflected in the reduced pay for that category as well.
Yes, back to, exactly what Colleen was pointing out was that would be considered part of the underemployment number, which has not come out yet.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
And then also, Tom, when you said you spoke with a local township employee, did they indicate what they're doing? I know that they're in similar circumstances, as you said. Did they indicate what they're doing at all to mediate the situation?
They're basically going through all the same steps we are. They're looking at every line, all the major buckets, the line items, potentially hiring freezes. I mean, they're doing everything that, looking at everything that the same, and their goal is they're trying to get to zero as close to zero as possible.
I think we just got to be careful. We keep saying zero, and that sounds great, but I think it's important that the people know with zero comes some pain. So we will continue to work toward getting the best, the best overall evaluation we can. But I think if we keep saying zero, that's going to lead people to believe that.
I don't disagree, but that's why I keep saying zero, get to as close to zero as possible. And as possible is a key word.
Understood.
Hey, any further discussion? Okay, with that, then we will move on to board and committee reports.